Okay, so it's 12 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone to our webinar, ADHD Goes to School. Our presenter today is Dr. Candice Murray from the BC Children's Hospital's Provincial ADHD Clinic. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. My name is Michelle Horn, and I'm the Program Manager for the BC Children's Kelty Mental Health Resource Center. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I live and work on the beautiful, unceded Coast Salish traditional territory. And I give thanks to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So before we get started, I just wanted to provide a very brief overview of the Kelty Center and what we offer. So we're a provincial mental health and substance use resource center, and we assist families across the province by helping with understanding and navigating the mental health system, listening and offering peer support from parent peer support workers through a collaboration with Family Smart, and also connecting families to resources and tools. We will be putting our contact information back up at the end of the presentation, so no need to jot it down now. I also wanted to note that this webinar is part of a larger webinar series that is a collaboration between the Kelty Center and the Provincial ADHD program at BC Children's. So all of the webinars in this series have been recorded and will be available on our website at keltymentalhealth.ca/ADHD webinar series. The slides and the recording from today's webinar will be available from this link by March 10th. You'll also receive an email with this link tomorrow, so no need to copy it down. Okay, a few housekeeping notes as well. So as mentioned at the very beginning, everyone is automatically muted and your cameras are turned off, so we can't see or hear you. You don't need to worry about that. You will have an opportunity to ask Dr. Murray questions after the presentation. So please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A icon you'll see at the bottom of your screen. There has been an option enabled where you can vote for questions that have been asked by others that you would also like to see answered, as well as an option for you to submit your questions anonymously. Please submit any technical or logistical questions, such as if you're having issues with audio or have a comment, through the chat icon. At the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up, and we'd love your feedback so we can improve and enhance future webinars. We also wanted to note that this information in this webinar applies to the context in British Columbia. If you're in another jurisdiction, please consult with your local health authority for further information. Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Candice Murray is a registered psychologist who has been practicing in the area of ADHD for over 20 years. Dr. Murray currently works in and is the former director of the Provincial ADHD program at BC Children's Hospital. She's a clinical instructor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Murray developed a treatment program for university students with ADHD, funded by the Doctors of BC, and also the Rolling with ADHD series, which is a free online program for parents of children with ADHD. She has published research articles and reviews on pediatric and adult ADHD. Dr. Murray is frequently an invited guest speaker at provincial and national conferences on ADHD. So thank you so much, Dr. Murray, for being with us today, and I'll now pass it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging with respect and gratitude that I live and work in the beautiful unceded Coast Salish traditional territory, and I give thanks to the Coquitlam, Musqueam, Squamish, Stalo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Today, I will be talking about how to support your child and teen with ADHD at school. There is so much information to cover on this topic, and I will not be able to get to all of the material that I'd like to. So it's best to consider this as an overview and aim to take away some key messages that relate to you and your family and your child specifically. Think of yourself as being at a buffet. If you fill your plate and try to eat everything, you're not going to feel too great. Just pick a couple of things that you think you can manage and see how it goes. Please note that the core strategies are similar across the ages, most of them are, but you may need to modify them for older kids or younger kids. I want to start by letting you know about a major challenge that families of children with ADHD face in the province of British Columbia. So in BC, there's no Ministry of Education category in the special needs categories for children with ADHD. So unless a child with ADHD has a coexisting disorder, like a learning disability, a behavior disorder, autism, or they have a chronic medical condition, or they meet the criteria for being gifted, they do not have access to an individual education plan. It's at the discretion of the school. And an IEP, or an individual education plan, is a document that outlines your child's strengths, their learning needs, and how they will be accommodated at school. So your advocacy in this province is greatly required. Along those lines, the Centre for ADHD Awareness is trying to mobilize parents right now to ask all Ministry of Educations across Canada to recognize ADHD as a learning risk. And I strongly urge you to visit their website today for more information about what you can do. It can take as short as 5 minutes. I checked yesterday, only about over 200 parents had responded, and most of them were in Ontario. So please try to do that today. My review of ADHD is going to be very brief. An excellent presentation on the basics of ADHD by Dr. Ryan Chan can be viewed as part of the Kelty ADHD webinar series. So, children with ADHD have difficulties regulating or controlling what they focus on and for how long. They focus very deeply or hyper-focus when a task is interesting to them, when it's new, and when there's frequent feedback. So features that are embedded in video games like Fortnite or social media apps like Snapchat. When children are in this zone, teachers might say that your child is having difficulty transitioning away from tasks. On the other hand, they have trouble focusing when a task is not interesting to them, very repetitive or familiar, or if they're not getting enough feedback. So when kids with ADHD are in this zone, teachers may say that your child is not completing their work in class or is very distracted. Most children with ADHD also have difficulties regulating or controlling restlessness. So they may move around more or just feel restless inside, and they can struggle with impulsivity. Just a word about impulsivity that's very important. Impulsive behavior is the observable part. Children with ADHD also have very quick thoughts, judgments, and they have quick emotional reactions. When kids with ADHD are having difficulty controlling their behavior, especially their impulsivity, they might be getting more reprimands and punishment at school than other kids. Okay, so children with ADHD also have trouble with executive functioning. Executive functions are located in the very front part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. It's the blue area in this slide, where imaging studies have shown less cortical thickening and less dopamine activity. Those are important features of brain development. In typical children, this part of the brain only becomes fully mature in their 20s. So imaging studies from the National Institute of Mental Health comparing children with ADHD, which are the images on top, to children without ADHD, which are the purple images on the bottom at different ages, has shown that brain development is similar in terms of the overall pattern in both groups, but the ADHD brain develops more slowly by about 30%. So in other words, the ADHD brain develops in a normal way, just at a slower rate. So we might call it immature. And here in the slide, you can see that at age 7, the dark blue part is not as developed as in a typical brain, the dark purple part. That's the cortical thickening of the brain, and that just helps the brain function optimally. So what this tells us is that it's not that kids with ADHD won't perform executive functioning tasks. The issue is that they lag behind kids their age. And parents always ask me, well, do they catch up at some point? And the fact is we just don't know. We do know that some people no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD as adults, like others do. While others do. ADHD experts believe that a combination of factors are involved in better outcomes for your kids, including having a supportive school environment and developing really good coping skills. So parents and teachers play a major role in this. And I'm going to talk about more about executive functioning in a couple minutes. Okay, finally, don't get freaked out about this slide. There are many other co-occurring challenges below what is visible and what people think about and when they think about ADHD. So kids with ADHD have trouble falling asleep at night. They have a distorted sense of time. They're socially immature. They have learning problems, which I'll talk about today. They also have a lot of anxiety and sadness. So I encourage you to look at Chris Dendy's ADHD Iceberg at attitudemag.com and take a closer look at all the hidden challenges that your child experiences. Of course, you probably know this already because you live it, but what I'd like you to do is share this with your child's teacher, and so that they can maybe understand a little bit more about the extra challenges that your child is facing. So in summary, ADHD is not a behavior disorder any more than autism is or dyslexia. Symptoms are not intentional, and the behavior we see is just the outward manifestation of their neurological differences. Although many people experience the symptoms of ADHD some of the time, they don't have ADHD. It's sort of like if you're sad once in a while, it doesn't mean that you have clinical depression. It's also not caused by poor parenting, too many screens, and a particular diet. Okay, so I'm just going to show the evidence-based treatments for ADHD. We have 5 solidly researched areas. So learning about ADHD in itself, so you attending this presentation today, is a form of treatment. So learning about ADHD by parents, teachers, and the children themselves is really important. Medication is also an evidence-based treatment for ADHD, and it's often the first line of treatment. Parent training programs are also an evidence-based treatment for ADHD, as well as classroom accommodations and support and organizational skills interventions. And I'll be focusing, of course, on points 4 and 5 today. In elementary school, evidence supports tools like daily communication, daily report cards, token systems, giving more praise, giving clear instructions, ignoring minor ADHD behaviors. So very similar to the parent training programs and a lot of the skills that you see in our Rolling with ADHD series. In middle and high school, the evidence supports direct training in organizational skills, such as note-taking, as long as children are getting monitoring and feedback while they're learning those skills. Okay, so how does ADHD impact learning? Well, distractibility has the effect of your child taking mini vacations every day during class, which ultimately leads to learning gaps, especially in subjects like math, where current learning is often based on information previously taught. It's kind of like a staircase. If you miss earlier parts, it's really hard to keep going. Restlessness often leads to your child prioritizing speed over accuracy. And then impulsivity leads to making quick decisions without considering all of the information available, as you can see in this little math slide down here. Quick judgments like the ones in orange often occur, and these are the parts of ADHD that aren't as visible. So your child might look at something and say, I can't do this, I'm stupid, this is going to take forever. And so when this occurs in children with ADHD, when they're facing a perceived challenge, it can evoke very strong feelings that interfere with their learning. All right, so in order to understand how to advocate for your child, you need to understand the executive functioning challenges that they face. And I'm going to walk you through Dr. Tom Brown's model of executive functioning so you understand the reason why your child does the things they do. Okay, so let's say your child is doing a research paper on cats. The first step in the model is activation. So an executive functioning skill is getting started. And children with ADHD often can't get started on tasks. Why? Well, partially they may lack interest in the task. So they may say something like, I don't care about cats. They may not have a sense of time urgency. So they may think, oh, I have tons of time to do that. They may be focused on something more interesting to them, like Minecraft, and have trouble shifting away from it. But a lot of the time, they don't know how to organize and prioritize, and they avoid for that reason. So it's a skills deficit. They just don't know where to start. They can't break the steps down or figure out the sequence in which they have to do the steps for the project. There's so much information about cats. What do I do? What do I include? So they avoid. As I said, avoidance is like procrastination, and with teenagers, what you see is late nights and all-nighters for teens asking for extensions or handing in papers late. Second part of the model is sustaining and shifting attention, very important to ADHD. So once your child gets started, they can get distracted, as mentioned earlier, or they might get really stuck on less important stuff, like they spend too much time on the cool title page and not enough time on their summary or conclusion. And I know that many of you are sitting beside your children in order to help shepherd them through the process of getting their work done. Number 3 is effort. So children with ADHD have difficulty regulating their alertness. And you know this because you've seen it. They get tired very quickly sometimes, and other times they're so alert that they can't settle down, like at nighttime usually. So their circadian rhythms are a little bit off as well. They can be sluggish and slow to process information sometimes and struggle with energy to push through with challenges. Sometimes they'll give up as a consequence of this. The 4th step is emotion. So children with ADHD often have a low threshold for frustration, for worry, for disappointment. They get angry or upset quickly, and their emotions seem really out of sync with the, with the facts of the situation. Next step is memory. So working memory is implicated in ADHD, which means it's hard for your child to hold more than one piece of information in mind at once. Your child has great difficulty remembering what they want to say, the information they've learned, while they have to think about things like grammar, punctuation, and spelling. So they end up cutting corners during that process. And then finally, they may not notice when people are annoyed, hurt, or puzzled, like when you're trying to help them with their homework. They may jump to conclusions quickly and then act on their thoughts. They often don't have insight and awareness into all of the struggles that they have in the moment that they're having them. Okay, so in terms of concrete examples of other areas where the children with ADHD have difficulty, when they read, they may skip lines and words, lose track of what they're reading, add or replace words, and this really affects reading comprehension more than anything. They'll often tell me that they go through a whole page and then have kind of a blank in their brain about what they've just read. With math, they tend to have difficulty with very repetitive math, like learning multiplication tables, figuring out word problems, because they have difficulty knowing what's essential and what's not essential information. And you see that sometimes in their social interactions. Also with multi-step problems, they often have difficulty holding multiple pieces of information in their head, and so working memory can affect multi-step math problems. And finally, as I sort of indicated in the last example, the big example, the Tom Brown executive functioning model, writing is almost always a problem for kids with ADHD because there are so many demands on executive functioning. So they have trouble starting because they can't organize their ideas, they miss details, they miss punctuation, capitalization, and they really don't like editing it once they're done. And the research just shows the outcome of all of these neurological differences. So we see that on this slide, we're seeing kids with ADHD don't complete their work as much. It's less accurate if it is done. They're off task more. Less homework is being done. And then in middle school and high school, they're less organized. And I would say they're not necessarily less organized. It's just the demands have increased so much for them to be independent, and teachers and parents are backing off, that the deficits that were there just start to sort of really show. Okay, so clearly ADHD impacts learning, and I'm going to spend the next little while talking about strategies that help. Okay. So the key strategies I've organized into 5 areas. Kids with ADHD need to move. Even if they don't have the hyperactivity, kids with the inattentive ADHD need to move to pay attention. The tasks need to be broken down. Information needs to be externalized. Kids with ADHD need more feedback than other children, and they need more praise. I'm going to organize the strategies moving from tools that target the internal state of your child and then moving out to other aspects in their environment, okay? I'm going to start with strategies that target the internal state of your child. So medication, fuel, and exercise or movement are tools that target the core ADHD symptoms from the inside out. I'm not going to be discussing medication in this presentation, but it is the most effective tool for improving the regulation of attention for most children with ADHD. Food and exercise are key foundations of self-regulation. I strongly encourage you to see Dr. Miranda's presentation on the Kelty website for more ideas around all of what I'm discussing right now. She is a great advocate and resource in this area. So children, like everyone with ADHD, regulate better if they have food and fuel. Food and fuel help everyone regulate, but children and teens with ADHD need it more. To avoid your child getting hangry or the slump in alertness that occurs in the afternoon, kids with ADHD need a fuel boost. So this is what I'm recommending for parents. First of all, make sure the food you're sending is easy to eat. So if all food could be served on a stick, so it's portable, kids with ADHD would probably eat without as many problems. So send granola bars, tortilla wraps, apples, bags of goldfish. Soup would be something that would be not a great lunch idea for most kids with ADHD. It just takes too long to eat. So send easy food. Secondly, kids with ADHD who do not take medicine rush outside or talk while others are eating, and they often skip their lunch and snacks. If they take medicine for their ADHD, they often have a reduced appetite and don't feel like eating even though they need something. So for children, for parents who are watching who have children in elementary school, you need to request that a lunch supervisor or teacher checks in on your child about their food intake at a certain point. Then thirdly, research shows that kids with ADHD get an exaggerated 2 p.m. slump in their alertness, and they do benefit from a shot of glucose, and I usually recommend them having a juice box at school around 2 o'clock. Okay, so movement is an essential tool for self-regulation. Before school, if possible, children with ADHD need to move. So if they can walk to school, if they can ride their bike to school, or if it's safe to let them off a few blocks away from school, please make an effort to do these things. Exercise needs to be prioritized. So some schools do have outdoor exercise programs in the morning before school starts. So if they do exist, sign your child up or check with the principal to see if there's a possibility of setting up a 10-minute walk or run in the morning for kids. It will benefit all kids, it just benefits your kids more. Recess and lunch shouldn't be used as punishment. It's just taking away the very thing that kids with ADHD need to be able to learn in school. So if this is happening, I suggest that you meet with the teacher or the school principal and try to brainstorm an active chore instead of being kept inside for recess and lunch as a punishment. Children need to move at their desks, so consider the 5 senses here. So movement tools, mouth tools like chewing gum, visual tools like doodling. Just a word about doodling. Research does show that doodling is better than not doodling for most kids, but newer research is showing that it should be related to the content that the child is learning. So if they're learning about cats, they should be doodling, drawing a picture of a cat and writing down key points about what the teacher is saying. So sort of like a fun way of note-taking. In class, kids with ADHD need to move more. So if they have active duties like taking attendance, passing out materials, being the door person would be great. And then they also need breaks from class. So maybe they can deliver messages to other teachers or to the office, go get themselves a drink, or even have a hallway pass. So an agreement with their teacher that they get these 3 laminated passes, and when they really need a break to walk around, they can go put the pass on the teacher's desk. No conversation needed. They leave as long as it's understood that they come back in a certain amount of time. Okay, moving away from the child zone, I'm now going to go into the task zone. So characteristics about the task that make them more ADHD friendly. So what I want you to do is advocate for choice of reading materials and writing topics as much as possible. Giving a choice increases your child's interest and helps them engage and focus. So Diary of a Wimpy Kid got a lot of kids with ADHD into reading because the books were funny and relatable. And there also wasn't a lot of words on each page, which is the next step. Break things down. So this is one of the most important strategies for kids with ADHD. Children with ADHD need less material on a page. It's less overwhelming. So graphic novels are ADHD friendly, and now there are even really cool graphic novels for teens, like the manga series, if your child is into that kind of thing. For older kids in high school where there's not a lot of opportunities for choice in terms of the novel that the class is reading, you can make less words on a page by just old school putting up a piece of paper to block out the information so their eyes aren't darting all over the page. Some kids tell me they like using a Kindle because they can limit the amount of words on a page, and they can also make the font bigger. So just some ideas, again, about putting less material on a page. Scoring rubrics are so helpful for kids with ADHD. It lets them know how to organize their time and be clear about the information that they need to include. I would strongly advocate for your child having a scoring rubric when they're working on a project or a paper. Graphic organizers help kids with ADHD organize information in a logical sequence, and it encourages them to add more details. When they're writing, they don't have to use their working memory because they can just refer to what they've written down here. And there are also software programs that have graphic organizers for kids who have written output problems and who need to work on a computer. And by the way, over 60% of your kids have difficulty with printing and writing. They need a keyboarding class as much as possible. Okay, another example of breaking things down and therefore letting your child get more feedback, which we know helps with their focus. Break things down into smaller steps. So here's an example of a writing assignment. You can see how it's broken down into sections. It helps prioritize and organize for your child. It's more manageable for them so they don't get overwhelmed, and it gives your child an opportunity for more feedback and motivation. Editing, the dreaded editing process for kids with ADHD, having some kind of shortcut for how, or reminder for how to chunk down the editing process. And I would ask if the teacher could build in some bonus marks for motivating your child to catch their errors and edit their work. Another example of breaking things down is less visual information on the page, just an example of a spelling test and a math test. Again, less overwhelming and more consistent with your child's attention span. Okay, still in the task zone, we want to move learning from passive learning to active learning. And I have a couple examples of where you would do this. With reading, we want your kids to skim the summaries of what they're about to read, chapter headings, images first. There's one method called the SQ3R method. You can Google that. But essentially, it's previewing the information and then having your child have questions about what they're going to read that they have to answer. So the process is more active. So they're reading to answer questions. They should also take notes when they're reading and writing down main characters and points, which again makes them more engaged in the process. For editing their work, children with ADHD and teens with ADHD often, as I've said, dislike editing and avoid doing so. It's repetitive, it's boring. They feel like they've just finished the task. They don't want to see it again. They skip doing this. So make it multisensory. What I often recommend is rather than just looking at what they've written, read it out loud so they can hear their mistakes. Again, you're moving the process to a more passive process to a more active process. There's also text-to-speech software like read and write program software that will read their material out loud to them. So they're processing it not just, again, visually, but in their auditory parts of the brain. There's also editing software like Grammarly that can help children with ADHD get through that process. Okay, listening. When children and teens, especially with ADHD, are listening, I tell them to take notes, to stay focused during class, and to process the information more deeply. So again, multisensory learning. I want them not just to hear what's being said, but to see it by writing it down. And in their movement, they're storing the information in different parts of the brain, so it improves their recall of the information. If your child isn't moving, they probably aren't listening. One of my favorite tools is the Livescribe Smartpen for older kids, for teens with ADHD. It has a camera and a microphone, and it helps with working memory because if they've taken notes and they get home and there's something really important missing because they have a working memory problem when they're taking notes, or if their notes don't make sense, the pen will play back the part of the lecture that your child has missed or where the notes don't make sense, okay? Just check it out. It's really cool. The main issue is children with ADHD lose things, and these pens are kind of expensive. So I would also, if you're going to get something like this, like a Smartpen, check out the Tile app. Many of you may already know about this, but it's a way to keep track of your belongings. Put a little kind of microchip on the belonging, and you can track it with your phone if it gets lost. Okay, classroom zone. So seating type is very important. Individual desks are better for core academic work for kids with ADHD. Communal desks are okay for projects and group work, although this arrangement will be harder for kids with ADHD. So you can also request a study carrel in the classroom as long as it's framed in a positive way, never as a punishment. I'll show you an example in a minute about that. Also, working in the resource room is really helpful, especially for quizzes, exams, and tests, and it's a great option for high school students who have ADHD. Okay, so a few years ago, my son kept talking about this battleship desk in his class that he hoped that he would get a chance to use, and I heard so much about this battleship desk. It was so coveted by all the kids in his class. I went in for the parent-teacher conference and asked to see the battleship desk, and this was it. So, and inside there were photos of ships taped to the walls. And so just a reminder that sometimes a bit of creativity it turns a learning tool that many kids avoid into a treat. Okay, so other areas of the classroom zone that, that can be helpful if they're modified. Sitting your child close to the teacher. So you see in this picture here, there's a boy with a red shirt in front of the teacher. So the value of this is there are fewer distractions in your child's visual field. There's fewer things that your child has to tune out. There are fewer visual distractions and auditory distractions. And in the picture above, you see there's a girl sitting at the back of the class, and look at all the stuff that she has to tune out. Not just what's going on in front of her that she sees, but whispering and noises and so on, okay? So there's just so many more distractions at the back of the class. When the classroom is noisy, and if your child has sensory issues, or even if they just have ADHD, using headphones or earplugs to block out the sounds can be really, really, really useful. All right. Sarah Ward, if you don't know about her work, you should look her up. I have her website here, efpractice.com, talks about the sweep of time for kids with ADHD. So it puts time in context. So what we want is children having more visual reminders of time. They can see more information at a glance with an analog clock, which is this clock right up here, than a digital one. So they see that they've been working for maybe 27 minutes and they have about 33 minutes left until they get to go outside, for example. So they see a lot more information at one time. I also am a fan of bringing back watches with alarms, not relying on, you're not letting your children rely on their phone or an Apple Watch to tell the time. There's just too many distractions, too many temptations. Also in the class zone, a visual breakdown of the day is good for the whole class, but great for kids with ADHD so they can anticipate what's coming next. Also, homework written down and broken down by the assignment, the materials needed, the date that it was signed, the date it's due, and really important, what do they do once they're done? Do they just need to be ready to discuss it? Do they need to hand it in to the teacher? Do they need to email it in? What is the process? So that is really important information to have written down. The daily report card is an evidence-based tool for elementary school age children with ADHD to increase the behaviors you want to see. So you have a visual of the target behaviors that you want to increase and the points that they've earned. It can go in your child's agenda and go back and forth daily, and the points can be traded in for privileges in the class. This is a highly effective intervention for elementary school age kids. So finally, the teacher zone. Many of the interventions have to do with a teacher's individual style and approach. But you can make suggestions for what works for my child in the letter to your teacher, which I'm going to be showing and discussing in a couple minutes. You can also advocate for your child being assigned to a teacher with a warm, positive style in the spring when classes are being arranged. So here we have one of the main things we want is positive feedback for your child. Children with ADHD get much more negative feedback generally, and so they really need that positive feedback. It can be verbal, it can be nonverbal, like a smile, a thumbs up. Praise is the most effective way to increase desired behavior. It tells your child what you need them to do. If you really want to up the ante, use a reward system. The problem with punishment is it's overused and it doesn't teach your child what to do. It just tells them what you don't want them to do. Okay, I'm going to demonstrate instructions. So just pretend you're sitting in a class or in a meeting right now and I say this to you. Take out your math book, open it to page 87. You're in chapter 8, work on questions 1, 2, skip 3, 4, then do 5 and 6. For question 5, do A, B, C, not D. Please show all of your work and hand it in at 10:15. So children with ADHD and teens with ADHD are still wondering where the heck their math book is when they tune back in and hear that something is due around 10:15 and they have no idea what it is. And this is where panic and anxiety set in. So instructions need to be given one at a time at the point of performance. This is a term coined by Russell Barkley, who says that children with ADHD need to hear the instruction when the behavior is expected to occur, not 5 minutes before and not three pieces of instruction 5 minutes before. Instruction when you want the behavior to occur, and ideally in school with a written backup for important information. You can also ask the teacher to, when they are giving instructions to your child, to use their name, make eye contact, and a brief touch on their elbow or shoulder to make sure that they are actually listening. And then finally, when there is conflict, the best approach for kids with ADHD, for all kids, but especially for kids with ADHD who have problems regulating their attention and with executive functioning, is to remain calm and listen to them. So children with ADHD have difficulty with verbal expression. They often miss parts of stories or events that have occurred because of attention issues when the event occurred. They may have working memory issues, so when they're having trouble holding information from the past and present at the same time, and they may be emotionally dysregulated or upset, so they can't access their executive functions. So the other part of this is that they often assume they're in trouble. So their fight or flight system's been activated. What they need is time and space. If their explanation doesn't make sense, ask the teacher just to give them time and space. So that concludes the section on a few strategies for the child's internal state, for tasks, for classroom setup, and instruction style that you can advocate for. A relatively newer intervention that research has shown to be beneficial for children and teens is direct teaching of organizational skills. Okay, so in a nutshell, and there could be a whole different presentation on this, skills instructions need to be concrete. So things like how to put together a binder, how to record assignments, where to put their due dates, how to use checklists, how to track time for tasks, how to break things into steps. Referring back to many of the strategies as I've also talked about, children need to be taught how to do those things for themselves. We know that the really important factors for this being successful is practicing with feedback and having parents and teachers involved. So research shows that these skills programs are more effective if they happen during the school day compared to after-school programs. So during a study or a resource block, when there's a strong alliance between the child and the teacher, usually a resource teacher in high school, when students attend more than 80% of the sessions, of course, so they have to be there to benefit from them. And the really cool thing about this research is their grades don't just improve at the end of the programs, they continue to improve 6 to 12 months after the training ends. So really, really important. And that's a rare finding in research that you continue to get benefits after treatment ends. So for preteens and teenagers with ADHD, advocate strongly for a study skills block with the support of a resource teacher to teach and reinforce organizational skills. All right, so in summary, keep these things in mind and work with the teacher to tailor the specifics to your child. More movement, break tasks down, externalize information, more feedback, increase praise. All right, we're getting there. Okay, now homework. So moving on to the dreaded homework struggles. Homework has different purposes. It can be to practice and review or reinforce learned information. It can be to prepare for learning, like preloading. It can be extending learned material to new situations, and it can be the integration of information, like doing book reports and projects. So, what this graph shows is the relationship between grades and homework. And the research shows that that homework appears to have more benefit for high school students than elementary students in terms of getting higher grades, if you're just looking at achievement, okay? But besides grades, homework may have value in the development of executive functioning skills, okay? But you need to watch how much time it takes. Kind of rule of thumb is 10 minutes per grade. Keep the experience as light as possible. Try not to have a lot of conflict, and have a reward for completion of the task or for working for a certain amount of time. If your child is struggling academically in a subject, they need resource support or access to a tutor. Homework will not fix this. So why is homework so difficult for kids and teens with ADHD? So look at all the steps involved. There are at least 8 steps. So at the top of the diagram, before we even have the teacher assigning work, is the amount and type of homework reasonable for your child? Let the teacher know how long homework is taking your child. Again, think about it should be around 10 minutes per grade for a typical child, and it should be reviewing taught material most of the time in the earlier grades. So if it's taking longer than that, there needs to be a conversation. If your child is having unfinished work sent home, problem-solve strategies to support in-class work completion, like the ones I've presented today. So the first step is, how is homework being assigned and communicated? It needs to be written on the board, not at the very end of the day as children are rushing to leave class. It's too distracting for kids with ADHD. Can your child record the information accurately? Rushing, fine motor problems interfere with recording information. Maybe they need to take a photo of what's written on the board. Maybe they need to put it in their planner at 2 o'clock and not closer to 3 o'clock. Maybe the teacher can post information on the class website. So there needs to be a system for communicating what the homework is. And in my experience, that is where where homework usually falls apart, or where there's lots of problems. Okay. Third part, do they have all the materials they need? There needs to be a system so they can check that they have the materials. So either the teacher can cue them to check, or they have a watch or phone that sets off an alarm that signals to them that they need to check for their materials, or having extra sets of books at home. Number 4 is planning to do the homework. So this happens at home, using wall calendars, using planners, working this part out so there's a plan for when to do the homework, sticking to the plan, which involves managing time, your child's time, and usually requires your supervision. Then completing the work and checking it over, again, requires usually parental supervision and removing distractions. Putting the work back in their school bag, which usually kids with ADHD will need a prompt to do. And then finally, when they get to school, handing it back in. Which is surprisingly a place where a lot of this stuff falls apart, especially for teenagers. They forget to hand it in. So here's just some examples of a planner, of having a wall calendar, a plasticized one in your child's room with due dates and when they're going to get their work done. Studying time, preparation time, not just due dates. And then this is really essential, having a very vivid folder that has 2 sections. Left-hand side is things to do, the right-hand side is things that need to be turned in. Kids may need a cue from their teacher. Younger kids may need cues to remember to bring this out each day. Okay, so Cooper, who developed the sort of stages of homework model and who did the research on the benefits of homework, talks about the roles that parents can play in homework. So being the stage manager, so making sure that there's reduced distractions during homework, that screens are removed, and that medications, if your child takes medicine for ADHD, are still active. It's very hard to focus as these medications are wearing off. Being a motivator, so using a reward system or just positive reinforcement, verbal, nonverbal. Being a role model, so maybe putting down your phone when your child is doing their homework and doing what they're doing. If they're reading, grab a book. If they're doing math, do some banking. Monitoring, so watching to see if they're getting frustrated so you can cue them to take a break. Monitoring that the length and content of the homework is reasonable for your child. And then being a mentor, so staying near but not stepping in unless you're asked to. If you've made reasonable efforts to troubleshoot the problem and support with your child, and to support your child, intense battles with your child might not be worth it. Your child might be just too exhausted after a full day of school to expend more energy. So you may need to speak with the teacher about reducing and sometimes eliminating homework, especially in elementary school. It's a little trickier in high school, but you can still advocate when there's a problem. So finally, advocacy. And I want to emphasize that listening to this presentation, you are already in the process of advocating for your child, okay? So you have a lot of information now that hopefully wasn't there before, or that it's been reinforced. So the information that I have presented, as I said, is a really big part of advocacy. Think of you and your child's teacher as a team, okay? You need to work collaboratively together. Most teachers are highly motivated to help and appreciate insights about your child that you can give them. If you do hit a wall, you can ask the resource teacher, the school counselor, or even the principal to join the process of advocating for your child's needs. Don't be afraid to bring it to the next level if you really need to. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to try to work with the teacher, but you also need to sometimes take it to the next level. And I've just put up here the organizational system, should you need to go that route. Very quickly, if you don't have a binder for your child, create one to keep track of all the information you need to advocate for your child, okay? Communication early with your child's teacher is really important. So you need to introduce yourself in September, not in the first week. Teachers are overwhelmed. There's a lot of adjustments going on. Second or third week by the latest. Discuss your experience and your teacher's experience, your child's teacher's experience with ADHD. Provide a one-page handout on your child, which I'll show you in a minute. Discuss seating arrangements, homework system, and possibly an incentive program. In high school, the resource teacher is the key point person, okay? There are so many different teachers, and the point person or case manager is usually the resource teacher or the school counselor. But be realistic. There are so many teachers involved in high school, and you won't have as much control. You can try to prioritize requesting a teacher for a subject that your child is struggling in. This is the one pager that I want you to do for your teacher, for your child's teacher, okay? If your child doesn't have an IEP, there may be no clear record of your child's needs. Don't assume your teacher has in-depth knowledge about ADHD. Many do, but many don't. And even if they do, they don't know how ADHD impacts your child. In high school, you may need to meet with a specific teacher if your teen is struggling in their class. So this page is just strengths that your child has, interpersonal strengths, their interests and activities, how ADHD impacts them the most, what they struggle with the most, what are things that you've learned don't work for your child, and then the key is what strategies have been effective that other teachers have used in the past. This is a really important piece of advocacy. Then I want you to keep communicating throughout the school year. okay? September is not enough. So I want you to keep in touch between report cards. Report cards are not a great time to get in touch with teachers because they're really busy. It's the busiest time of the year for them. Don't arrange meetings on the fly. If you need to meet with your child's teacher, arrange a proper, right now it would be a Zoom meeting, and then hopefully after COVID in person. Please inform them about any issues that are going on for your child right away, okay? So if your child is having trouble sleeping, if you're changing the medicine or the medication is not working, let the teacher know. Also, if there's anything going on, if you're noticing any bullying or social problems going on, the earlier the teacher knows, the more they can do to help your child, okay? Talk with the teacher about class and teacher assignments in early spring for the following September. This is really important. A lot of the strategies that I've talked about today really depend on the style of the teacher. So you need to advocate for your child having a teacher whose style fits with what your child needs. And you can do this, as I said, in spring. I would also say that when you have meetings, be ready to reframe comments using ADHD terms. So if you hear he's talking out of turn, he's calling out in class, you can say, yeah, he's really impulsive. Do you have any ideas about what might help from your experience with other children with ADHD? She's not listening in class. Yes, she struggles to regulate her attention. I can share some ideas that work at home. In summary, be informed, be realistic about the process. Take one day at a time and pick your battles, but don't be afraid to raise your concerns to the next level if you need to, and follow the protocols. This is a long journey. I want you to think of this as a marathon and not a sprint. You need to pace yourself so you don't burn out. And remember that you are not alone. There are a lot of us out there, including teachers and administrators, who understand. Thank you. Here's some resources. And I'm going to remind you to jump on to the website for CADAC before the end of the day and advocate for your child at the government level.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murray. Such a wealth of information and really practical tips jammed into 45 minutes. So well done. So I think we'll move on to the Q&A now. And Dr. Murray, if you wouldn't mind going to the very last line that just has our contact information on it, just for those folks that might need to leave a few minutes early if they wanted to access our contact information. So we'll pop into the questions now. There was so many great ones that were asked during the presentation. We'll try to get to as many as possible in the time we have remaining. If we don't get to your question, please feel free to email us or call us at the Kelty Center, and the team there would be happy to assist you with providing resources or information or peer support. Okay, so the first question was from a parent who's wondering if you can provide direction on where to find parent training programs.
So, good question. I would start with the Rolling with ADHD program that we developed in the ADHD clinic, and it's available on the Kelty mental health website. Other than that, you can contact the mental health team in the area that you live and see if they're offering any parenting programs. There's also Vancouver Coastal. If you live in the Vancouver Coastal District, they offer ADHD parent programs as well for parents of children and teens with ADHD.
Great. And I'll ask my colleagues to just put a link to Rolling with ADHD in the chat for those of you as well. Mm-hmm. So the next question is from a parent who is wondering if you could provide some advice on how to help a child with ADHD who struggles with lying. With lying?
Okay. At school or at home?
It doesn't say. This one was quite a few other parents like this question, so it seems like in general, if a child is having with lying.
Okay, so this is a really tough question to answer without having information about the particular case, which we're not asking for. So as I said in this talk, a lot of kids with ADHD, first of all, they often look like they're lying when they're not. So Again, the context is really important. They don't process information the same way other kids do. So their stories often have gaps in them and don't make sense. And that's often, as I said, because they didn't capture all the information, or they get flustered and overwhelmed when explaining. The other issue is that they do get in trouble more than other kids. And so they can have a tendency to lie more because they just don't want to be in trouble again. And one of the things that parenting programs focus on is raising sort of the positives at home, so children don't feel like they're always in trouble and don't have as much need to lie. If you're doing all sort of the validation at home and the positive reinforcement and the child-centered play, there may be less lying. Now, in cases where a child is lying, like if they're lying repetitively, then I would take a step back and look at sort of what's going on in the bigger picture in terms of the climate and the relationship between the child and the parent. But if there is an incident of lying, you would need to have some kind of consequence. And it might be a reparation, it might be doing a chore for the family, it might be replacing something that they've taken or broken that they said that they didn't replace or break. Using a logical consequence, a natural consequence. It's such a hard question to answer more generally, but those are the basics.
Yeah, and last week we had a webinar with Dr. Randall Gillis on parenting a child with ADHD, and she talked quite a bit about the consequences and how to do that or not do that at home. So I would suggest checking out that webinar recording as well for more information.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question came up a few times from a few different parents, and it's around how to teach children how to step back before impulsively reacting at school and causing social issues at school. So a few examples that I saw through different chat questions was one, a child feeling slighted by a school friend and retaliating impulsively, or a kindergartner throwing a rock at another child impulsively. So how do you teach kids how to step back before impulsively reacting, causing then cause issues at school?
Mm-hmm. So it kind of depends on the age of the child. So for young children, I would recommend that people look at Miranda Doherty's self-regulation talk that's available on the Kelty Mental Health website. There aren't a lot of interventions directed at teaching young children how to control that. The interventions are really focused on having adult supervision and cueing children in the moment and giving them space. One of the problems at school that I didn't have time to talk about is a lot of the issues for kids with ADHD happen during recess and lunch when there's a lot of stimulation and very little parental supervision. So again, there's, without knowing sort of the history behind why it's happening, we know that having parents and teachers and adults supporting and scaffolding in the moment is the best way to deal with those issues. And that's not always possible. I often recommend when parents are having play dates, have one child over, not three, because there can be a combination of overstimulation and less supervision. As kids get older, they can learn strategies to get more self-control. And that's in the domain of cognitive behavior therapy and a bit of dialectical behavior therapy. There's kind of emergency measures, and there's measures they can use or strategies they can use as their emotions are building up. But most kids with ADHD, the buildup is so quickly that they need those emergency measures. And, that often involves giving them a period of time or a space to separate and settle down, and then make reparations afterwards.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have just 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask just one more question and a short one. So someone is asking if you can suggest a good typing program.
I like the BBC Code Dance Mat typing. It's
Okay.
bbc.ukco. I think it's DanceMat typing. That's the one that all the right type is the one the schools use. Kids with ADHD hate it. It's so boring. But this is like, it's a little Scottish sheep who tells you how to type. It's super cute. It's kind of a little silly, but kids with ADHD love silly stuff, right? So yeah, DanceMat typing. I think Miranda might have some suggestions around that as well. I'm not sure if I don't think she talked about that in her presentation, but yeah. Sorry, the BBC DanceMat typing is the one that comes to my mind.
Great, thank you so much. And we'll make sure that we put a link to that in the email we send out tomorrow for our participants.
Oh, great.
If they were interested.
Okay.
So that brings us to 1 o'clock. So I think we'll wrap up there. So thank you so much, Dr. Murray, for joining us today and for all of this wonderful information. Thank you to everyone who joined today and taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate you joining us today. And again, feel free to contact us at the Kelty Center if you had a question or wanted to connect with our peer support workers or be connected to resources. You can email us at keltycenter@cw.bc.ca. Our toll-free phone number is 1-800-665-1822 from anywhere in BC. And again, once we end the webinar, a survey will pop up, and we really encourage you to complete that so we can enhance our future webinars. So thank you again, Dr. Murray, and thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.